Alright, appears I have to move this camera thingy again. Like many of these video sessions, I feel like I'm doing some sort of circus project that is maybe gonna fall apart at a moment's notice. So I've got this long arm with the selfie thing at the end attached to a partition that's beside the table so that it's high enough. Because this is sort of a big, well, big board for me anyway. I think it's about, let's see, well, 18 by 24. And it's going to be another one of these experiments with ink. I have no clue if it's going to end up being just one big huge mess. It's on something called Claybord, B-O-R-D. I remember seeing another artist friend of mine use it, but I can't remember who it was off the top of my head. And adding to the circus atmosphere is because my table is built up so it's pretty high, so I can stand at it and work. This piece being kind of big, spread out on the table, is too high. So right now, I'm going to be painting while standing on like a step stool kind of thing, so I can look down on this and see the whole image and not have it be fading away in perspective, you know, because I'm too close, too far down here. Anyway, a friend of mine posted this photograph at one point, and I thought it looked pretty neat. I want to do something with it. We'll see what I end up doing with it. Since, like I said, I don't really have too much in the way of concrete plans, and I've never worked on this board before, this clay board. It says it's absorbent and has all these great qualities, but I really don't know how it's going to work with this ink, if it's going to just totally slide around a lot on it, or if it's going to soak in. I don't know, I might work on this for maybe an hour, and then work on it again some other time later, because it's probably going to require a couple sessions, I have a feeling, because some of these areas I might be picking up the board and moving it. So if one area is not dry enough and the stuff ends up moving around not in the direction that I want, then it could become even more of a mess. I mean, it looks like this is actually soaking in because the color of the board is a little different where I'm adding it. But like I said, it's still going to be a lot of I don't know what's going to happen next kind of stuff. Because one thing that I do like to do with this ink is apply it to whatever surface I'm on and add water or other colors, and then just sort of move the surface around, let it flow to some degree on its own. So we'll see. It would help if I had more have my ink prepared. So now I got to get some white over here because my jar of white is getting a little bit too empty. So I have a big jar that I can use to refill it. Only thing is I want this white to be able to sort of flow into some of this yellow. And if it's already too dry, then that ain't gonna happen. And some of this white looks like it's a little too thin. So you can see it's a case of sort of adding the pigment and then moving the board around to get some movement here. And I don't know how much some of this stuff's going to flow into one another. Sometimes my problem is I try and do too much too quickly, and then I have to sort of clean up after it later. So in the case of this, you know, I might be adding the red a little bit too early. We'll see. Creating not the right direction of paint flow in every area that I want. Although, you know, sometimes that can actually work to your advantage because you end up with some areas that you didn't expect. But this is basically just sort of an experimental thing, kind of a warm-up to some other things I gotta do. And sometimes you gotta sop up some of the extra water or pigment so it doesn't flow too much. This is probably going to be one of those pieces that ends up looking very different by the time it's done. And if anybody is actually commenting or anything, I can't really see it too well because I can't see my phone. It's flipped. It's in this selfie thing for one thing, and it's flipped so the screen, well, the screen's under this, the black plastic of the selfie device, and the computer is a little too far away to just glance over. So if anybody says anything and I don't respond, that's why. What I'll probably end up doing is getting a lot of these big shapes done and then going in later to add some of the detail or tighten up some of the detail depending on how much I want to do that. And these interior areas are going to be really dark. I'm not sure yet what color I'm going to use in that area, but it's going to be pretty dark. And actually I shouldn't even work on this because I was going to put a certain color behind this, so I probably should just leave it alone once I get some of these edge colors done. Sometimes when I do these videos of things that I'm not sure of at all how they're going to go, I definitely feel like there's way too many chances to come off looking really bad. And it looks like you can lift some of this stuff up to some degree, except for the little border area. You probably might not even be able to see the drawing on this. Basically, this woman with her head thrown back and this red hair going everywhere. But it's pretty light very basic drawing on this board. I guess I just get too much of a kick out of seeing the ink moving around on the surface and seeing what happens as it moves. Sometimes I wish I could have the finished product somehow just be a single moment captured while this stuff's moving around, because you can sort of control where it goes to some degree, but it's very hard to totally control it. Maybe I'll check the computer and see who's here. Someone's asking me if I'm having an epileptic seizure. I'll never tell. You just have to figure it out for yourself. I have two friends on Facebook who seem to handle some of these really loose experiments where you're sort of letting the paint do what it's going to do. One of them, her name's Patricia Ariel, and she does some really neat pieces. I think she has much better control over the situation than I do, to be honest. And Bud Cook, who works, I think, primarily in acrylics. And is not so much a paint flow kind of person as a lot of interesting types of strokes and mark making. This is going to take a while to coalesce into an actual recognizable image, since I'm mainly working on some of these abstract areas. Basically, this is a big mass of hair, red hair flying around in the air, that I'm sort of making into these abstract shapes. I mean, it's areas like in here that I end up liking, and over here where you can see paint melding into another area, and it ends up sort of being reminiscent of seeing ink float around in an aquarium or something, or some tiny body of water where you're seeing all these different things happening in motion in front of you. Maybe I'll give some form to something here to have sort of a little landmark to keep track of. Got to fill up some more ink. Sometimes I'm amazed that I avoid having some huge industrial ink disaster with all these jars and stuff sitting around here. And you know what I wish I had is some sort of mahl stick. But I don't. So my hand doesn't end up sitting on the surface, basically. And now I'm right beside the phone, so I gotta try not to talk too loud. What's going to be interesting too is when I start working over some of these areas later on that already have ink on them, because I don't really know from experience how they're going to hold up, if they're going to stay where they're at, if they're going to come up, lift off, or what. This is going to be uncomfortable too, because I'm standing on this stool and still having to bend over. I gotta be careful not to hit the phone and jostle it too. Or actually, I think I'm barely touching one part of the arm at the top of my head, so I gotta be careful. standing up here at the top of the room where it's the hottest is going to be uncomfortable, I can tell. Yeah, still no clue really how this is gonna turn out. So now I'm actually drawing with the stopper. You can get some sort of almost calligraphic kind of lines doing it this way sometimes, but you're putting a fair amount of ink down, so then you have to be careful when I tilt it. Oh well, that'll be covered up later. Well, it's taken some shape here to some degree. And I think my back needs a tiny break, so I think I'll check again to see who's hanging around. Oh. For anyone that just got here or didn't hear the beginning, I'm painting on this thing called Claybord, which has an interesting the reaction that the ink is having is something that I'm still learning as I go along. About 18 by 24, and I'm using FW ink in a sort of loose expressionistic fashion, I suppose you'd call it. And sometimes just tightening up a few little areas. It's a good thing I have a big jar of violet, because I have a feeling I'm going to use all of it up in this one, with all these big areas that are going to be basically filled with it. And it sort of sits on top here. Which means I end up using more ink than I might if it was on paper. It'd be soaking in a little bit more. And I add some water to the edges to try and sort of draw the ink out, down into whatever direction that I want. And I'll probably use the stopper again because I like that effect that it's giving it. It's definitely, as far as the hardness of the surface, it almost feels like I'm painting on Formica or something. A lot of ink sliding around on this board. That's not what I want, really. Sounds like there's a mouse in here, but it's the board sliding on the table. Squeaky, 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 squeaky. one thing I don't know if I'm going to be able to get, and maybe I don't want it, is any like really soft gradations, and because of this sort of the paint sitting up on the board like you were painting on plastic or something like that. I mean, that might not be a bad thing. This part's tough because you gotta watch the place that you're really wanting to move the ink around on, but then you have to keep an eye on some of the other areas so they're not going too far in one direction or messing up some other area. Okay. I think I'm gonna maybe let this sit in a second before I move on to another area, so that the area, what I'm doing right now, is not going to be corrupted by picking the board up and move it around to change some other area. Get a few little things done here first, and then come back to it in about, well, it'll probably take half an hour for this to dry because some of this ink is pretty heavy on this. So check back later.